Hey, I'm Bailey. I read 12 books in January, which I'm pretty happy with, especially because I didn't read that much in the first half of the month. I do think I've had my lowest average rating ever. It was a 3.5, but I also don't think ratings are always like the most useful metric. I'm just going to jump into what I read. Before I even read this book, I owned 3 copies, which is objectively too many for a book you've never read, but I was confident I would love this book, and I was correct. This is an adult multi-point of view fantasy. It begins by following Miriam, a young Jewish girl whose father is a moneylender, and he is not particularly good at it. Miriam takes up the mantle of moneylending when her mother is ill, and Miriam is very good at it, so good that people say she can turn silver into gold. This rumor gets her in a little bit of trouble with the Starek, who are kind of a fae-like creature that live in the forest. A lord of this world hears that Miriam can turn silver into gold and strikes a bargain with her to turn small amounts of silver into gold. I adored this book. I just loved everything about it. I really liked a Jewish author's take on the Jewish moneylender trope. I thought it was done very deftly and very interestingly with a lot of nuance, and obviously, most of the time that trope is used in a very offensive way by non-Jewish people, and I thought it was interesting to see a Jewish woman taking on that trope, kind of in conversation with a lot of grim fairy tales. The character work in this book is absolutely superb. I loved each character, and as we switch point of view, it is very easy to immediately feel rooted in the point of view that you're in. I was particularly interested as the book progressed in the way that Novik talks about class, as our 3 primary characters are in very different social classes. I am relatively certain this book will end up on my favorites of the year list. I loved it so much. It was just a wonderful time. I am so happy I finally read this book. I'm just enamored with it. I gave it 5 stars. Next up, I read The Soulmate Equation by Christina Lauren. This is my first Christina Lauren book. This is an adult rom-com. It follows a single mom who does freelance data analysis and a man who is one of the founders of a company that is kind of like Hinge plus 23andMe. I would particularly recommend this book to anyone who has been obsessed with the Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes case. You can see little nods to Theranos throughout this book in a way that I think is really interesting. The authors handle the ethical questions that come with a DNA-based dating service really well and robustly throughout the course of the book. My biggest complaint about this book was I don't think that the hero's behavior before he becomes romantically involved with the heroine is addressed in a way that I found satisfying, but as the book progressed, I did think it was cute, and I had a good time reading it. I gave it 4 stars. It was a fun time. I'm trying to make sure I read at least 1 nonfiction book every month this year, and this month I read Codename Lees by Larry Loftus. This book follows Odette Sampson, who was a spy during World War II. She was World War II's most highly decorated spy, male or female, so that's interesting. Odette was born in France and then moved to England a little bit later in life, where she married an Englishman and had children. And then when the war starts, through a series of small mishaps, ends up a spy because she speaks French like a native, because she is a native. Probably my favorite part of this book was when Loftus talks about the reaction to Odette's story once she comes back to England after the war ends. Loftus does a great job of moving through Odette's time in the war very factually and in a way that is very easy to understand as the reader. Sometimes this book was a bit dry, but my biggest issue with it was I don't think Loftus really does much analysis of the events that happened in Odette's life in a way that I found really weird. It was almost like he was trying to completely remove the lens of a biographer, which, I don't know, didn't work for me and I found intensely odd. And also there were so many times where I thought he could have been drawing a through line of the way that gender discrimination impacted her spying life and the reaction when she got back to Britain. But there were many things that I just was like, why aren't you drawing a through line? Why aren't you analyzing this like a historian? Isn't that supposed to be your job? I don't know. I thought it was a little weird, but I enjoyed the story overall. I gave it 3 stars. If you like World War II nonfiction, maybe jump into this one. Next up, I read This Thing Between Us by Gus Moreno. This is an adult horror. It is only the 5th horror I've ever read, but I do think I'm gonna have to do a deep dive into that genre because I'm really liking it. This book follows a man whose wife has recently died. She dies after they get an Eatsa, which is kind of an Alexa or a Google Home kind of contraption that seems to maybe be possessed. It isn't largely about the tech side of it, but we do get into a little bit more of a demon-y, dark force kind of vibe and less a technological horror vibe. But largely, this book is about grief in a way that I think is really beautifully done. I think there are a lot of people, me included, who might not want to pick up a book about a man processing the death of a woman because of, you know, the trope of fridging. But I would say with this book in particular, that is very much the wrong impulse. If you want to read about grief in any form, I think that this book handles it absolutely beautifully. Obviously, it's a horror. There are quite a few trigger warnings to look up. There's a dog on the cover. You know, do with that what you will. The end is weird. The middle is weird. Horror gets weird, but I think it was a really good, interesting weird. I really like this book. I ended up giving it 4 stars, and I will definitely be reading Gus Moreno in the future. And then I decided to finally read Concrete Rose by Angie Thomas. I think I bought this book the day it came out, so it's taken me a minute to finally get to it. I think I was worried that I wasn't going to love it as much as I've loved Thomas's previous student books, because I always have that worry when I'm reading an author that I haven't read in a while. What if I don't love it as much as I'm remembering having loved her previous work? And that was very much not the case. I loved this book, and I loved On the Come Up even more, so I should have known that I was going to love Concrete Rose. Concrete Rose is a prequel to The Hate U Give. It follows Star's father, Maverick, while he's in his senior year of high school. I guess it starts slightly before his senior year of high school. And Thomas does an excellent job of playing with the information that the reader knows is going to happen, because you've read The Hate U Give and you know kind of the, I don't know, end point. I guess not end point, he's still alive, but where his timeline ends up. You know a lot of the events of Maverick's life. And Thomas does an excellent job of sticking to those events and kind of playing with the reader's expectation of what is about to happen. It is incredibly impressive. You know, turns out Angie Thomas is a good writer. Obviously, everybody knows that. It's so good. If you love a strong character voice, obviously that is a strength of Thomas. She does a really excellent job of making you feel like you are in conversation with this person. You feel like you are talking to Maverick about his life, and he's telling you his regrets and his hopes and his dreams, and it's so good. Also, while I was reading this, I had an intense desire to read like a political fantasy written by Angie Thomas. I think that she would do an excellent job of a political fantasy. I don't know, this book just gave me that vibe. Obviously, I loved it. I gave it 5 stars. Had a great time reading it. I forgot to do my favorite statistic. I cried in Spinning Silver, The Soulmate Equation, and Codename Lees. I did not cry in This Thing Between Us, and then I did cry in Concrete Rose. Next, I read This God of Mine by Sophie Jordan. I read this book based off a recommendation from the podcast Fated Mates. This book did not make me cry. I loved the premise of this book. The premise is that our heroine Clara has disgraced herself and is kind of faking a pregnancy in order to not marry a terrible man, and because she is now disgraced, she's going to live with her brother in Scotland. She's leaving London, and when she gets to Scotland, Laird Hunt McLaren finds out that she is pregnant and thinks that marrying her will be the loophole to get him out of his family curse, which is that all of the men for the past couple hundred years have died before their first child is born. And he thinks if his first child is not biologically his child, then he will be able to, you know, live to a ripe old age, parent this child, and have like a wife he never has another child with again. But he'll be able to live, and he will end the curse because his line will not biologically continue. Obviously, the issue here is that she is not pregnant. I just thought that was like a really fun premise. I do think the premise is fairly well explored. I wish the curse had been talked about a little bit more. I think I read a lot of fantasy and I was expecting like a little bit more engaging with the idea of a curse, but I did like that Jordan never like lands on if the curse is a real thing or not. I do think this book has way too much going on for how short it is. There just were so many elements happening that I don't think they all got the amount of page time that they deserved, especially because with all of the things going on, I didn't feel like there was enough time spent with the central couple together, so I didn't really understand why they liked each other so much. I don't know. As we got towards the end of the book, I did find it very sweet, which was good. So by the end, I was on board. I was just like, I don't really understand why y'all like each other, but sure, I'll go with it. Jordan does write an emotional roller coaster very well, though. You will feel the highs and the lows. I gave this book 3 stars. I will probably read a Sophie Jordan in the future. Mostly my goal is to find what historical romance like I love, because I want to love this genre and I just keep on being kind of like in the middle on it. Next, I read Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ng. I kind of think this is a perfect book. I loved everything about it. It definitely made me cry. I had lost my highlighter pencil that I like to use when I'm reading, and so I underlined while I was reading this book and wrote little notes in the marge. I annotated, I guess, while I was reading, and I underlined so many parts of this book. I was really just enchanted by the language and so drawn into all of these characters. If you like a character-driven story and you haven't read this yet, this is such a good character-driven fiction. This book mainly follows 2 families, the Warrens and the Richardsons. The Warrens, it consists of a single mother, Mia, and her daughter, Pearl. They are new in town and they end up renting from Mrs. Richardson. Mrs. Richardson is the wife of Mr. Richardson. They have 4 children and they kind of live in a perfect house, and they both have kind of upstanding careers, and it's all very proper and perfect. Or that's how it seems. The book starts at the end with the Richardsons' house burning down, and then we jump to when the Warrens first arrive in town. This is, I would say, a pretty character-focused book, but the plot is still excellent. There are so many threads that you are trying to like tie together and figure out while you're reading, but the character work is really just what stands out here. It's absolutely stellar. The main conflict of this book is that the Warrens and the Richardsons kind of are on different sides when there is a white couple trying to adopt a Chinese baby whose mother wants custody of her back. I loved this book so much. It made me cry. I gave it 5 stars. I think it's kind of perfect. Next, I read How to Be Perfect by Mike Schur. I pre-ordered a signed copy and it has not gotten to me yet, so I'll have it up somewhere. Mike Schur is the creator of The Good Place, and he co-created Parks and Rec and Brooklyn Nine-Nine, and he was a writer on the U.S. Office. If you like any of those, especially The Good Place, I would recommend How to Be Perfect. The book goes through kind of the research that Schur did to do the moral philosophy part of the show The Good Place. In a very conversational and approachable way, he goes through the major movements in Western moral and ethical philosophy. He brings you through history and through different movements and kind of shows you what he thinks about the different kinds of moral philosophy. Throughout the book, he uses a mix of funny, silly questions and pretty serious questions to try to come to the correct conclusion using moral and ethical philosophy. And because Sher is a comedy writer and not a philosopher, the book is quite funny. I mean, I'm sure there's something by a philosopher that's very funny, but this book is very funny throughout. I listened to the audiobook, which Sher reads himself, and also there are cameos from all of the main actors of The Good Place, which was just very fun. If you're a Good Place fan, I really recommend the audiobook, especially if you like The Good Place, the podcast. This book made me cry. There's a particularly beautiful part towards the end of the book where Sher is talking about his children that just like made me cry a lot, and I thought was beautiful. I gave it 5 stars because I think this book does exactly what it wanted to do. I think it does it well. I think it's a good time, and I think if you like kind of digestible philosophy, or if you like Mike Sher or any of his work, you'll like this book too. Next up, I read Heaven Official's Blessing by Mo Sheng-Tong Shu. I think the internet says MXTX quite often. If you love this book, I think maybe you should skip what I'm going to say because it will hurt your feelings. I hated this so much. Like, so much. I thought the translation was frankly terrible. I thought the language did not flow. I thought it was incredibly clunky. I thought it was hard to understand at times. I thought the use of prepositions was sometimes completely unnecessary and sometimes just made no sense. I think the translator probably did a great job doing a direct translation, but didn't do a very good job of making it a nice book to read in English. Maybe I would have liked the story if there had been a better translator who had like a different philosophy about how you should translate things, but I hated the translation so much. I found the language pretty unpleasant to read. But on top of that, I did find a lot of the tone of this book very jarring in a way that I kind of at first thought was the translation, but I have since been told that that's probably indicative of the original as well. I thought it went wildly between very formal and very childish. There's lots of like all caps and exclamation points in places that I didn't always understand why that was an exclamation point place. I don't know. Normally I don't care about that kind of thing. I just was confused, and I think also I just like wasn't liking it, so maybe everything bothered me when you don't like something. I cannot overstate how much I hated the way this book was written, and I'm not totally sure because I haven't read what comes after this, and I will not read what comes after this, but I did read some interviews with the author, and the way she talks about gay men is a little bit concerning to me sometimes. It's kind of fetishy. I don't know, it made me a little bit uncomfortable. I need to look a little bit harder and find gay men talking about this book, because some of the things I've heard about in the future of this series, it seemed weird. The kind of culture around this book is very like, oh, they're so cute and little and gay and oh my gosh, which I think is dehumanizing and fetishizing and not okay. I don't know if that is something that there's a lot of basis for in the content, but I do think that that criticism is very understandable with the fandom. But back to the content of this book, I found it incredibly predictable. I didn't like how I was basically skimming the book and I still guessed all of the big plot things that were coming. I think if you're skimming, you should have to be confused and you shouldn't like skim and also be able to guess everything that's coming. I think it's poorly written. I think it might be a little problematic, but I'm not sure about that. And I hate the translation. And I didn't like the content. So there you go. I liked nothing about this book. I'm very sorry if you love it. The first about 50 pages is a solid info dump. I personally didn't think it ever got exciting, but the beginning is an absolute slog to get through. I truly don't think it got better ever, but other people disagree with me. But yeah, the beginning is a solid block of info dumping, just telling you things that happened that seemed like maybe they were interesting, but you don't get to see them happen because you are in an info dump. I didn't love that. Next, I read Blindsided by Amy Dawes. I read this through Kindle Unlimited, which I have now canceled my subscription to because I hated this book that much. Also, I don't think I've ever really loved something I've read through Kindle Unlimited, and I was paying for it and never using it, and then when I was using it, I wasn't really loving what I read, so I just decided to cancel. As soon as I finished this book, I was like, I need to cancel Kindle Unlimited. So clearly I didn't have a fun time with this book. I picked up this book because I saw a cute TikTok about it, so that was my bad. I should have done more research before I actually read the book. I think if I had read some reviews, I would have realized I might not love this book. I think Book Talk is great. I have a very fun time over there. I post little videos and I love watching other people's videos. I think a lot of people have like great personalities and make very cute content, but I do think that I personally am having trouble finding people whose reading taste I like, especially with like romance book talk. Yeah, I think that's probably the best way to analyze what has happened here. Also, the person whose video I watched, I'd never seen them before, so I shouldn't have just been like, oh, I bet we agree. I should have gone through their content. It doesn't matter. I didn't like this book. This book is set in London. It's about a 29-year-old whose best friend is a football player. He finds out she's a virgin because of a game of Never Have I Ever. Well, he doesn't find out she's a virgin. He is sure that she's lying, and then kind of just like, hey, we should bang, and then they do. I don't know. That's kind of the plot. I didn't like this book at all. I started out this book having like a fun time and being excited, like, oh, this is gonna be a fun little like romance quick read. And then just things started building that made me just dislike this book a lot. If I hadn't read it in one sitting, I wouldn't have finished it. The heroine is named Freya. She is Cornish, and then the hero is Mac, who is Scottish. I think that the way this book handles British slang is bananas. It's written by an American, and I think it was not read by any British people before it was published, because there's just no way it was. It was baffling the way she used British slang and the amount of American things that she had these British people saying and doing. Like, kill shelters aren't a British thing to my knowledge. And they had a whole thing about kill shelters. Animal shelter situation is completely different in England than it is in the US. And you could just tell she didn't even like Google it to check. Because if you Google it, like a very quick Google search will show you that it's different. There were a lot of little things that happened throughout this book that just showed me that the author has poor research skills or does no research, which is fine, I guess, but it annoyed me. I was also kind of bothered that there was no sign when you start this book that it's connected to previous books, and by the time you get to the middle, you can totally tell that you're supposed to have context for some things that I had no context for. And there's a line in the middle that, as someone who's never read any of Amy Dawes' previous work, it just seemed incredibly fucked up, frankly. Like, maybe there is context that makes it not fucked up, but I don't have it, and it seemed fucked up to me. People were talking about, like, problems they were having in their life, and this woman was talking about how she's afraid that she's not a good enough partner to her, I don't know, boyfriend, husband, something, and that he'll try to kill himself again. And that idea was not pushed back on. Like, it was kind of pushed back on, like, oh, you shouldn't feel like that. But the idea that people kill themselves because their romantic relationships aren't fulfilling enough was not pushed back on at all. And I was just, I don't know, upset by that. I thought it was weird. Freya is meant to be a plus-sized person in this book. I don't think that she would use the word fat to describe herself, but she does constantly call herself chubby. But Dawes makes it very clear that she is kind of chubby, but she's not like gross chubby, which I thought was messed up. I didn't like that at all. Reading the book makes it seem like the author maybe has read like a couple of paragraphs about body positivity or has seen some like Instagram post of skinny people bending over to make themselves look like they have rolls, but doesn't really have any like active engagement with body positivity or fat liberation in any way that makes this understandable. By the end of the book, the main character has lost a bunch of weight, but like she's not too thin now, which is all, I don't know. I just thought the way that she talked about Freya's body was gross and did not make sense to me. Another issue I had with Freya was that she was incredibly childish and naive to an extent that was frankly ridiculous. She didn't know very basic things that I think most 29-year-old people who have watched television would know. And then suddenly, like 3/4 of the way through the book, she becomes incredibly confident in a way that doesn't match how she was behaving all the way up to that point. Like, it wasn't like a slow building of confidence. She just changes, and she starts making like sex jokes to old men she's just met. And I don't know, I thought her characterization was incredibly inconsistent. My last complaint is I thought the conflict felt really hollow. I wasn't that into it. I didn't think the stakes were very high, and I don't know, just I didn't like it. I didn't like this book. I didn't like the romance. I didn't care if they ended up together or not. I especially hated the third act conflict. I thought it was very unnecessary and didn't make a lot of logistical sense, but I don't know. I didn't like it. I won't be reading Amy Dawes in the future. That's fine. Gave it 1 star, didn't cry. So next I read Would Like to Meet by Rachel Winters. This is an arc that I've had for, I think, years, maybe year and a half, something like that, for quite a while. I really should have read it way earlier. I did start it right when I got it, and I just didn't like it that much. I don't know. And I decided to finish it because I had like 60% left and I thought I could like get through it in one go. The premise is there is a woman who is an assistant for a screenwriter who, I don't know, needs to submit their next, I don't know, screenplay for reasons. And they haven't worked on it, and they are like refusing to write a rom-com, and for some reason that's what they have to write. So for some reason our main character has to start like having meet cutes with as many people as possible in order to make one of them fall in love with her, because then it'll be like a movie and then love is real and this guy has to write a rom-com. I don't know. Clearly I thought it was contrived. Her first meet cute attempt fails, but she ends up meeting a single father and his child. There's kind of a love triangle between the boss guy and the single father guy. I don't think it's done very well, but it does exist. I found the work conflict very predictable. I didn't find it very surprising, and I didn't find the conclusion very satisfying, I think is what I will say about it. I thought that the single dad was maybe letting this strange woman around his young daughter a little bit more than seems advisable, but I don't have children, so who knows. I think this is a pretty cut and dry case of me needing to just like DNF books I don't like, because I think this was the 3rd book in a row I gave 1 star to. I did not like this book. I didn't like the writing style. I didn't like the characters. I wasn't into the plot. It wasn't for me, so I did not like it. And I should have just stopped reading it, but I didn't, and I finished it. Didn't like it. Didn't cry. And then I wanted to finish the month reading a book that I liked. I was just tried to pick a book. I only had like 1 or 2 days left of the month, so I picked a short book, but I wanted something that I would like, and I picked If You Come Softly by Jacqueline Woodson, and I absolutely loved this book. This is my first ever Jacqueline Woodson novel, and I imagine there will be a Jacqueline Woodson deep dive in my near future. The way she writes is just so beautiful, and this book in particular was like really tender and nuanced and just incredibly impressive. There's a reason why It got a 20-year anniversary printing, and that is that it is good. I loved this book so much. It has been clearly a long-lasting book in the cultural imagination, and I am so glad I finally picked up a Jacqueline Woodson. The title, If You Come Softly, obviously comes from an Audre Lorde poem. The story itself is inspired by Romeo and Juliet. It is about a Jewish 15-year-old girl and a black 15-year-old boy who are both new students at the same private school. This book talks a lot about family and fame and trying to find who you are, and does a really excellent job of writing two characters who are both in some ways trying to cling to their childhood while also trying to develop themselves as an adult. And the pair are obviously like beginning a romantic relationship, and it's just very well done. A lot of the book is about the intricacies of being in an interracial relationship, but the book is also just about grief and figuring out who you are and what your place in the world is going to be. I thought this book was beautiful. It made me cry a lot. I was about 80% of the way through, and I was like, I haven't cried yet. And then I cried a lot. But I really loved this book, and I would recommend it to absolutely everybody. I thought it was great. Gave it 5 stars. Probably my second favorite book of the month, maybe. I don't know. I liked it so much. That's what I read in January. I'm hoping to read about 10 books a month for the rest of the year. I read 12, so that's a slight surplus, which is nice for in the future if I undershoot it. Thank you for watching, assuming you got this far. Thanks for watching. Bye!